What's up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work to Game, and it is time to talk about it's just community feedback. So it's Friday. As Brian and I get back into the swing of things, the plan is for these to become collabs, but until then, I will be covering them because Brian does a ton of the legwork with the podcast. So here we go. This is going over Brian's videos on does Summoner suck and does Paladin suck? So it's part of a series on asking the opinion piece about the guide. It's just part of, as we do the coverage, eventually it will be there for all 18 jobs. And so we're just diving in on these two, and I'm focused on mostly the questions that I think will be prevalent across all the jobs. So I'm not really focused on Summoner or Paladin here. In addition to that, I do want to say Brian and I are not masters of Extremes and Savage, and Brian plays a lot of classes. I'm starting to get into more classes. So we're not going to promise to be the experts on these, but we do feel that we know enough about these to help people get started, to point them in the right direction. And then once they master those, if they want to go off and be even better, I encourage them to look for more advanced resources that probably would be a little hard to approach starting out. So we're going to focus more on that beginner side of things and just the general population so that we can kind of get to all of the jobs. So the first comment is from Omar. And it's about Paladin, so we're going to do Paladin first and Summoner second. So the Paladin question says, this video coming out when I first started leveling up my Paladin. Now, when you first start leveling up a class, unless you are power leveling it with the intention of keeping it as your main, you already have a class at cap and you're like, you know what, I'm going to switch, I'm doing it. Don't worry about it, because all of the classes play just fine in old content, and the rotations for many classes change throughout the leveling process. And so when we're talking about the state of a current class, we're typically talking about it at in-game levels with all of its abilities unlocked and in the end-game content. At the very least, your expert roulette and all of that, ideally with some context for things like the Extreme and the Savage, but just at a core level, you can run everything that's currently current for at least the casual level of players. So you're clearing your weekly raids with it, you're running expert roulettes with it. That's what we're talking about. So it's not a reason to not level any of them or a reason to level any of them, because the leveling process is really totally different. Now, Gald says, what is with all these clickbaity titles? Good Lord. So this is Brian. Brian came up with a naming convention. You know, does it suck? When I come out with all of my videos, I'll be just leaning into the exact same name so that we're very consistent there. It's just an opinion piece. Now, we've talked about it before, so I encourage you to go watch. We have a insert very clickable title here video with the thumbnail that says clickbait on it. And that is a chance for us to go into our view on clickbait. So we get it so much, it's hard to want to respond to all these comments because you're typing the same responses over and over and over. But at the end of the day, the way YouTube works, you're encouraged to make your videos very clickable without being misleading. The algorithm has ways to penalize you if you truly do mislead, and it has ways to gauge that. So you want to be as clickable as possible, and we have done tests over and over and over with certain types of titles versus other types of titles, and we publish 2 videos a day, 30 days a month, for a total of a minimum of 60 videos a month. We stream at least once a week. So we have a ton of content on this channel. And if you haven't seen that many of our videos, that's because not all of them make it onto your page, because not all of them have performed well when it comes to clickable and things like that. And so if you're seeing this video, that's because it did something right. And if you feel that all of our titles are a certain way, that could be one of 2 things. That could be that only one type of our videos is performing at that time across the board, or more likely, there's only one kind of video you have a history of clicking on. So if you tend to only see our content as positive, then the majority of our content is positive, but you probably only click on positive videos. If you think the majority of our content is negative, you probably only click on negative videos. And so I'm just telling you, we put out a crazy amount of content for one channel, and we try all sorts of things with our titles. I do not feel any of them are clickbaity, but if you would like to see why I feel that way, I encourage you to go see that video. Has and go. Being handicapped, I use a ton of macros, even though it's not recommended. I have no choice. Now, when we talk about not using macros, we're typically talking about it from the standpoint of it is not optimal. Not that it is not possible or that there's not a reason to do it. So if you have a reason to use macros, whether that's because it's what makes the class playable for you altogether, or it makes the class more enjoyable because it simplifies things, even though you do feel you're capable of doing it without macros, you just prefer it. Do whatever you want. This is a gaming experience, and as long as you're not hurting somebody else's gaming experience, whatever is fun for you, do it. So, you know, if you like glamoring, glamour. If you like playing with macros, play with macros. If you like playing Savage, play Savage. If you don't like playing Savage, it's totally optional. So there is so much flexibility in the play experience here. So I wanted to kind of touch on that, as well as point out that macros are an incredible tool. So even in the circumstances where we don't recommend them because maybe they're not optimal or they're not the top way, or we do recommend them because they're the way we prefer to play, even though there might be a more optimal way, like with crafting, where we use crafting macros to do large amounts of crafting, even though there is technically a more optimal way that could theoretically be squeaked out if you manually click the buttons, because you could watch for certain procs and things like that. You know, your use of macros is 100% made possible native in the game. So it is designed with the devs for your use. So use them as much or as little as makes sense to you. Mark, personally, I love the enmity combos being gone. When it comes to tanking, my favorite part is mitigating damage while dishing out my own damage. As long as you're willing to mitigate, if you want to treat it like a melee DPS, then this is probably the greatest expansion you have had yet for tanking. I like enmity combos. I like tanking to feel like it's different than DPS. But I'm not going to lie, for the purpose of going out on my own or clearing fates, it is really nice that I feel like I do a lot of damage. And it is really nice that I can focus on Fel Cleave on my warrior. And then my AoE rotation is just super fun. I know it's basically the 3 buttons, but on Gunbreaker, it's really cool to be tossing out that ring explosion, and just on the run, you can just boom, boom, and then drop that explosion. It's really fun. Hopefully it will hold up that much fun for me. That was my concern going into the expansion. There's no way I could know that. Everything's still too new. But hopefully come 5.2, 5.3, I'm still feeling this way, because I'm enjoying tanking a lot more than I thought I would. And it wasn't that I thought I wouldn't like it. I'm enjoying everything about Shadowbringers. Even the things I thought I would like, I'm still liking them more than I expected. Tim, I honestly feel Paladin is the best tank. I had this opinion too in 11. If you know Paladin well, you can survive far longer than any class they've seen. I hope they don't nerf it. Now, historically, while there have been nerfs, historically, they've focused more on a power creep type method where you just buff the things that are underperforming, has been how I feel the game has gone. So I don't think Paladin's going to be getting like a big nerf. I think that you'll see something like Warriors getting a buff. I think Gunbreaker's doing just fine. When I'm tanking as a Warrior, I feel most comfortable in the 2 tank content sharing with a Paladin or a Gunbreaker. I really feel like, regardless of player skill, that if I'm just focusing on the job, that those are the 2 jobs that I feel next to me I'm not going to look over and they're going to be dead. There are advantages to having a Dark Knight with me, and then of course I love Warrior, so having a second Warrior, I'm like, I get it. I know why you're playing Warrior because I know why I'm playing Warrior. But Paladin and Gunbreaker feel really good next to me. Brian's the one that gets to play Paladin this expansion until I finish capping my 9 jobs, and so I'm looking forward to it. The 2 jobs I was most sad to lose in the draft were Machinist and Paladin, so I'm looking forward to trying it out, hopefully before this expansion ends. And it looks good, so I'm glad everybody's enjoying it. Voldemort. Stormblood Summoner was great. Why fix something that isn't broken? Square Enix makes some really weird choices sometimes. So the reason they fixed it is because they actually changed the battle system at such a fundamental level. So when you talk about like the pet changes, when you talk about things like that, they force certain changes. So when you talk about like the desire to move away from certain classes feeling like they were necessary, but only for the purpose of buffing other classes, so they kind of stripped back things from Bard and stuff, it forces fundamental changes, because then you've pulled something out of the equation. So I don't think that the goal was to totally redo some of the jobs as much as they did. And then, I mean, the game changes. Like they can't win, because there's plenty of times this game gets complaints that it's too repetitive, it's too formulaic, and there are plenty of times that it's why fix something that isn't broken. So I think it's a tough spot to be in, and I think that the last 2 comments I get to will kind of show that, because the other thing is they're satisfying a ton of players, and more players than ever before, and so it's really hard to imagine being a handful of devs that have to make these decisions and hope that players like what they do. So I think they're just trying to move the needle forward, and I think they're trying to move into a well-balanced expansion within the context of all the jobs, and that does mean that there are going to be some changes that maybe on their own don't make sense. Like as a warrior, I feel like I had a lot more self-sustain in Stormblood, and I got that stripped away, and so as a warrior that felt like a loss. But my impression is that I could survive longer after my healer went down in Stormblood, but that may be better for overall party comp and overall balance of the typical classes and the typical dungeon experience, even though it feels like to me I got something taken away. So I hope that makes sense. Mojoga. I enjoyed the changes once I figured out what I was doing. That's another key part of this, is a lot of times when there's change, people are quick to not like it. But a big piece of that is that it is possible they were operating near the top of the previous set of possibilities, right? So they were optimal for that class, and now they're suboptimal for the new. So even if you have design A and design B, and they are equally identical of just as many actions per minute, just as much utility, just as much DPS, and somehow objectively you've measured it where there's a top player at both and they're just as much fun, moving from B to A or A to B, you're going to be comparing where you were up in that kind of top section of the one from playing it for 2 years or more to the bottom of the other. And so there's, at least during the learning curve, it's really easy for the new side to always feel really rough until you figure out what you're doing. So I think that's a really valuable comment there. Jason, super newbie to Final Fantasy XIV. MMO question. When you say, how is X job doing in Shadowbringers, does that mean how is X job since the latest patch level cap? In other words, these opinions are not dependent on the content itself, right? So there's two parts to job balance. The first is how the job feels on its own in a vacuum. And we start with those opinions before the expansion even goes live, because we're fed the changes during kind of that last round of live letters. When we start getting hints, we have things like the media tour and all of that, and we start gauging it. But those are faulty because it's only one half, and typically to get the other half, we're just plugging it into the previous expansion. So we were plugging changes we knew were coming, that we assumed were working a certain way in Shadowbringers, into Stormblood content, and of course they weren't designed for Stormblood content, they were designed for Shadowbringers content, and so we don't like it. The other half is the content itself, and the content itself, if the content makes you move a lot, then black mages naturally feel a little tougher. If it has you sit still a lot, then classes that have a lot of mobility in their balance maybe feel like they're a little underwhelming, seeing that black mage over there just going crazy. And so, the content is your context and the class is the subject, and it takes both to have a valid opinion, and so it's ever changing. So when we say how is X job in Shadowbringers, we're trying to talk in general, knowing that this video is going to live for at least 2 years, and that from patch to patch it is possible that potencies get adjusted, cooldowns get adjusted, content gets adjusted, and that the place of that job, either in DPS rankings or in utility or in difficulty, may adjust over the course of the expansion. So when we say how is that job, we're of course always talking from the time that video was filmed, which is not even always the time it's published, because sometimes changes get rolled out. Imagine, I'm in the middle of my warrior guides. It is possible that the last live letter will result in changes made to the game that by the time my warrior guides are complete are already slightly inaccurate. So they're accurate to the best of our ability at the time they're filmed, but that's just the nature of a living, breathing game like an MMO, as opposed to covering something like maybe a God of War or an Octopath Traveler, where you put out that guide, you're talking about static content, so you can really take your time and get it right and leave it there. Here, it's a little more shooting a moving target. So, you're right. We are talking about how is it since the latest patch level cap. So you may see updates to it that'll have a patch number, things like that. It's why we put Shadowbringers in the title. That's us learning, because our channel is now old enough that we need to go back and separate anything that maybe we didn't put Stormblood in the title because we thought that was obvious, because Stormblood was the expansion at the time they were published. And that's maybe not so obvious now that there is multiple iterations of that job out in space. So how is X job in Shadowbringers is something that we're trying to make one pass at all the jobs, and then we may need to come back to jobs that receive significant changes and touch back on them at a is X job fixed, is X job broken when it was perfect before, in our opinion. So yeah, it's not a newbie question, it's a valid question, and it's just the nature of YouTube, where you put out a video and it just lives forever and ever, and something like Final Fantasy, where you're only ever playing the current patch and previous patches get removed. Benjamin, We are just black mages with a glorified dot pet. And then Chronicles, I think it's the best it's ever been. So I wanted to kind of talk about those two in the context of each other because that's really the core change here. Some people love it and some people hate it, and that can be happening at the exact same time. And so I just thought that that was really interesting to see those two comments. They were relatively close together in their time that they were published. And that just kind of shows that where you're coming at from a job doesn't mean that, you know, I take one of those as I don't really like it in its perfect state. I don't think it's the best it's ever been. And somebody else who's literally just saying it's the best it's ever been. And all the jobs can be having that. No matter how much you may like the new machinist over the old machinist, it's possible somebody liked the old machinist and that person got a drastic overhaul to their job and maybe didn't ever want a robot. So, you know, when we talk about having millions and millions of players, it is something we want to keep in mind that like Brian and I are only talking about Brian and I, and we do our best to go out and get multiple viewpoints, and we like to have these community feedbacks to continue the discussion from the comment section on whatever original posts we're talking about into today. But these things change, and there are always viewpoints out there that differ than ours or than yours. It's an incredibly large community and everybody is welcome to their opinion, especially if they're not going to use it to somehow limit somebody else having joy in this game. My name's Chris with Work to Game. I hope you guys had a fantastic week. Thank you so much for the comments. YouTube's been having some weird stuff on the back end this week. So we have had, I'm not sure if we're getting all the comments. I know like our view numbers are like all over the place. Like literally I'll open it up and in the same pane, it'll say a video has this many views and that within the last 24 or 48 hours, it has this many views, but the video is less than 24 or 48 hours old. So those numbers should match. And they're off by like, not just a little bit, like they're crazy off. And so I know they're making some changes in the back end. So I appreciate the comments. Hopefully we're able to get to all of them. Thank you guys so much. And then as a side note at the end of this video, Brian and I are in the middle of making some big changes on the back end and of Work to Game on our back end on things that we want to bring to you guys. So, you know, I know that we now have a highlights channel. That link is going to be in the description. So any of you who stuck around, I encourage you to go watch that. Maybe you don't remember a lot of our old podcasts because you just consume a lot of content, or you have a poor memory like I do sometimes, or maybe you haven't tried our podcasts because they're a little long on the format for you. And so Brian's been grabbing some highlights from those, and we're starting to try to spin up a highlights channel together where we can just go grab highlights from that. And then we're talking about possibly doing the same with kind of gameplay. So in the link below should be the link to our casually hardcore highlights channel. And if you could go give that a subscription, try it out for a while, we would really appreciate it. Getting it over that 1,000 subscribers gives us it really helps us on the back end, and that's just something that it's just going to take time, we assume, but we'd appreciate you kind of coming over there and visiting that and seeing if that's a format you like. It's not something we wanted to put on Work to Game, but it is something that we think there was a demand for, and we wanted to try making that available. So have a fantastic day. I will see you guys next time.
Hey Chris, your shirt's pretty looking.
You know, honestly, it doesn't have Work to Game anywhere on it, but I like to support the channel.
Yeah.
So,
well, you can do that and also have a good looking shirt.
I don't really want that shirt. You think maybe it could be a different shirt? Well, cool. I think I'm going to click on one of the links somewhere around here, and I'm going to go see what we got.
Hello. It's really, really, really good.
You guys have a great day.
Take care.
You probably have a pretty shirt on.